So welcome everybody. Good morning. Today we are here to discuss just gamifying civics. Both Brian and I have worked to see how we might use games to bridge the gap between social emotional learning and civics. In case people are not familiar with the term social emotional learning, it's really a foundational skill that helps students learn about empathy, self-regulation, understanding perspectives, good decision making, and so on. And we found it to be kind of a critical skill to help kids be able to communicate more effectively, to work with one another to solve problems, and to achieve goals. And so that's why it's a very important piece for us in this initiative. So just a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. So just an overview of kind of why we're here, why games. We'll give examples of how we use games in the classroom and how we've also created partnerships to facilitate game creation and to creating experiences for students so that they can kind of step up and experience learning in a new way. And then, of course, how you can get started with this sort of initiative. So really quickly, I'll let Brian introduce himself before I take back over. Brian.
Yeah, my name is Brian Field. I'm a teacher over at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, and I also consult with President Lincoln's Cottage, which I'll be talking about a lot today, where we've designed a game, The Brave Ideas, and starting to integrate it into classrooms. And it's really starting to explore like the development of ideas and everything, which is the relation to like civics education and everything.
Great, thanks. As I was introduced, my name is Michelle. I'm a former teacher. I'm now based in Switzerland. I was interested in the topic of civics because A, that's how I started my teaching career, and B, I have seen how polarized society has gotten. I had lived in Spain and Switzerland before. I moved back to the US in 2015. 2016 election was very divisive, and it's really stayed that way in the US. So a former colleague and I decided we needed to do something. We both are from more rural parts of the US. We had taught in Switzerland, and we realized that, civics education is really, really critical for both of us. We've taught in Switzerland, we've taught in the US, and sometimes when we're presented with curriculum, it's very linear and it's very passive. It's very much like, this is how the government works, the end. You can vote. You can protest. And it really doesn't offer kids a dynamic space to think about how they could be active citizens, how they could use their agency to shape policy, how important policy is towards creating the future they want. And we realized that we needed more innovative and creative ways to engage kids in the topics that matter, the topics that they care about, but also B, to create the skills that they need to use their agency to do good. And then this is especially difficult in a time of polarization because it can be really hard to do these things in the classroom. I think Brian will attest for this. It's growing with the polarization. It tends to be more and more divisive. It makes it harder to talk about things in the classroom. You have more parents coming in saying if you want to talk about things, you're indoctrinating kids. So it's become really difficult, and we're really seeing policy take hold in what we are and are not allowed to talk about in the classroom, which books we are or are not allowed to present. And so this is why we've become more creative with just using different tools to engage kids, but also creating more partnerships so we still have outlets to ensure that kids get to have these really critical conversations and these critical opportunities to develop skills and feel like they have the power to act. That said, one thing I often, when we talk to organizations or we talk to parents, usually parents will say, we want critical thinking. We want a healthy democracy. And so sometimes when we're presented with our civics curriculum, people don't realize how emotional it is. And this is a big reason social emotional learning matters. I think in every country, there's topics that if you talk about, people act like it's, this is the way it is, but it's something that incites emotions in young people. So for instance, in the US, if we were to talk about election costs, kids often are angry. It's $1 billion campaign ticket. We're looking at the 2024 election, and people are asking, like, why do we have Biden and Trump again? Like, why are those the likely candidates? Didn't we just do this? And then it really gets into a conversation about lobbies and and the price tag it costs to run. And this is something kids don't necessarily like. When we talk about things like the electoral college or gerrymandering, these are issues in the US where, it's acted like we just are supposed to present it, and the kids don't have feelings about these things. These are things that they think are unfair. They're things they want to discuss. And we realized we needed to create opportunities and outlets for them to have healthy conversations, and that it's perfectly fine for them to question their system so that they can design something better if it's something that they don't agree with. This is a book I wrote with my colleague who I was a colleague in Switzerland, Brian Dieters, on preventing polarization. And we really focused on just opening up the lines of communication again, and really the least common denominator skills that we were noticing were preventing people from having conversations, but basically we noticed we've really gotten in an us versus them mentality, of course, which goes with the polarization. And there's the good guys and the bad guys, and of course the world is so much more complex than this. So we wondered, what are those basic skills that you need to help students understand complexity, to help understand that most people are trying to do good, or to do good things. And so we wrote this book as a way to kind of emphasize some of these social emotional learning skills, like having humility during a conversation, understanding moral ambiguity, understanding a change maker lens. Civics just isn't just about learning what the government is and does. It's about understanding how it's a tool to shape, again, the future that we want. So that said, we kind of had the content, we had the ideas, we had the experience, and I think that's what led us to this next phase of, well, what do we do about it? How do we create real opportunities to practice social emotional learning? Because it's easy to talk about, but how do you actually give experiences so students build and develop those skills? And how do you create more opportunities when it's getting harder and harder to do these things in our school system? And so, of course, this is where Gamifying Civics came about. So why games? There's a quote, and I don't remember it fully right now, but it's basically, tell me, I listen. Um, teach me, I learn. But it's basically, you need to experience things to learn. And I think we all agree that listening to something versus experiencing it is a completely different type of learning opportunity. And so, of course, when we play games, we are completely immersed in the experience. We're making the decisions. We're having to work in a team. We have goals we need to achieve to beat the game. And so when we see this, we are helping kids exercise the 4 C's, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity. But we're also helping them to develop some of those social emotional learning skills, like empathy. Like you have to sometimes understand where other people are coming from to be able to beat a game. You have to use teamwork to beat a game. Sometimes you have to lose with grace. So there's just these different skills that we employ when we play games, not just virtually, but also physical games. I'm sure everyone, I hope, has played Monopoly. If you probably played with someone who's like thrown the board because they were so angry because they didn't win. I mean, this is where you're practicing really basic skills on how you treat people, how you handle a loss, how you receive information. And so we feel like games really provide a nice outlet so that we can talk about and experiencing things in a more protected setting. And so, for instance, the game on the left, this is one that a teacher was using. It's from James Madison University. It's called Statecraft, but it's really helping kids kind of create these territories. And so they're the government. And all of a sudden, when they're the government, it really helps them understand and employ and experience what governments do, which is a much more effective way than us just sitting kind of and telling about them. On the right, we have the SDG game. This is a game I've collaborated with from someone here who does co-create impact. And it's an immersive game where people get to decide the actions that they're going to take to achieve the SDGs. And it's a hard game, but it's realistic. And usually after the end of the game, there's just this lovely reflection piece where people get to talk about why we're not moving forward. If the world they created is similar to the world we live in right now, what we would need to do differently. And it's just amazing because these immersive experiences really provide people with a new lens, because they're experiencing it, they feel it, to talk about issues and to engage with one another. So we're going to start with a little game here because I think one of the biggest things about playing games is that they don't need to be complicated. So if you wouldn't mind, everyone's going to get a Jamboard link. And what I'd like you to do, we're going to play a modified version of kind of Pictionary and Taboo. These are words that tend to be a bit loaded because I think everybody thinks they know what they mean, but do we actually all agree on what they mean? So if you go into the chat box, there'll be a link to a Jamboard. And what I'd like you to do is just find an empty slide, pick just one of these words and draw. It doesn't need to be pretty, what you think it means. If anyone has questions about the directions I gave, please don't hesitate or write in the chat box, and I will try a new way of framing that.
So we're defining the 4 words on screen, right?
Yeah, just pick one word, the one that resonates the most, and draw a picture of what that word means. And don't put the word you chose. We're going to see if we can guess based on your drawing the word that you've selected. I'll get started on here to give an example. So yes, just pick a slide and just draw. And when you're done, if you could just type done in the chat box. Okay, I'm going to get started then as people finish. So let's see if we can guess this first one. Anybody have guessed what this is? Okay, so again, oops. Freedom, politician, fact, law. I'm gonna go with freedom on this.
I think it's freedom, yeah. I would say
Yeah?
the same.
Okay. Can anyone guess what I was going for?
Law.
Law.
Ooh, a law?
Law as well.
Could it be fact?
Freedom, I think, because it's
Freedom?
crossing a border.
Ooh. Okay, I like that.
This is just Dadaism.
I'm gonna go with freedom.
Freedom, I would say so.
Freedom. Freedom. Law. Okay, nice. I'm going to go back to this if you didn't finish. Now, when we do games, and I don't know if you noticed this, but sometimes, for instance, we say things differently. Look at the difference between the first slide on freedom and then the other two slides to me were a bit more similar, where you have like nature and all of these things. And I've noticed and then notice with law, it's like the symbolic piece of paper, the scroll, or then you have the judge's thing. And so what we've noticed is when we hold on, I can't do two things at once. Let me hit present again. What we've noticed is even doing something as simple as that, kind of using like a Pictionary with like some words that kids have, we notice that in drawing these things, it just opens up our discussion in our mind to what things mean and how we have different perceptions of the same word. For instance, fact and opinion. This is one that always fascinates me because as soon as you I don't know if that's a good example, but sometimes, for instance, with fact, if I were to say something as provocative as there is a God, some kids will tell me that is a fact, and then other kids will say no, that is an opinion. And it's so interesting because as soon as we get into the nitty gritty of like what is fact, what is law, and so for instance, even some things around fact where, all of a sudden when kids write it, they might draw something around science. And then all of a sudden, other kids have certain beliefs that are not backed by science. But it's something that they firmly believe in. And so all of a sudden, it's just interesting because in drawing and doing these sorts of gamified opportunities, we're able for kids to kind of express themselves and have conversations where they're not right or wrong. They just get to play around and experience the different perceptions that people have around words, around concepts. And it can be a nice, playful way for us to understand that we see the world differently. And I think when we do games, no matter how basic, it incites conversations and helps us to explore our world in a way where we're just more tolerant of one another. So I don't know if anyone has any feedback on saying things like that, but we just wanted to just play something really, really quick and fun just to kind of exemplify, what we gain in just doing games. And I also feel too, like the energy is up, people are involved, and it's not just you talking anymore, right? Like everyone is immersed and is sharing. That said, I'm going to pass it over to Brian now, and he's going to talk about how we found using games to be helpful and inspirational and useful in the classroom, but also about how he's found new outlets to make gamification possible and community partnerships he's leveraged to bring these kind of experiences to young people.
Yeah, so just to start, like I consult with President Lincoln's Cottage and everything. And they to begin with, it was the Brave Ideas game. They knew they wanted to create a sort of like game and everything, but they didn't know how to really do it in-house and everything. So they were kind of looking around. They went to Game Genius a little bit, and then they said, we need to have some sort of teachers. And I think this is kind of very like common for nonprofits and everything, and museums especially, to where I kind of reach out and engage. But a lot of times it happens in more sort of like isolation. They have their sort of like social networks and everything, and then the educators kind of have their own, and they've kind of, at least in the United States, have been a little bit more separate and haven't been like communicating and collaborating together. And I think this is an avenue that we can do to try to like build this sort of up and explore a little bit more and build things together. A lot of it is just an exchange of information of like, this is what we have, or you should come visit us, rather than collaborating and build together and see what can come about of it. So they started to do that a lot around the time of COVID, saying like, well, we're all moving online. How can we sort of like, what do you need? And games started to come up a lot. And games came up a lot because they realized that it's awkward to talk online and we need to get people sort of like communicating and everything. Games are really unique. It's an opportunity to like risk take it, your insecurities. If you lose, you lose. If you win, it's great, right? And then you just kind of move on to the next sort of thing. So in schools, especially, even with like quiet kids, they slowly start to engage in, and that's particularly like what we want to see in classrooms, is to get that level of sort of engagement and everything. And so the next stage of this is they knew they wanted to do it with civic engagement and everything. And particularly they've been working with high schoolers, and they said, we feel like we're too late. That like if we really need to start participating in civic engagement and everything, and in classrooms and everything, that we need to do it in elementary sort of schools and everything. Like we need to go at a much younger sort of age, that we're targeting the wrong sort of groups. It's good to target those groups, but like we can do better. And they got a lot of pushback from their like funding and grants and everything, but they said like, let us just try this, and it allowed it to happen. The first time that we met, they said, you know, we have this game that we've had on the shelf for a little bit that was kind of sort of designed to talk about like community sort of issues and everything. And immediately within the first 3 seconds, I was like, I can't play that in my classroom. Like it was very controversial sort of topics. And this is where we are at in classrooms. It's very sort of like difficult. There's a lot more participation from several different sort of groups that are engaging their way into sort of classrooms and everything. And teachers, I think, a lot of times are feeling a little bit more pressured on things and disengaging from it. So while you think that like in that sort of realm that we should have increased conversations and everything, we're not really seeing those increased sort of conversations. We're seeing a little disengagement because there's just too many sort of active players and everything. And there's limitations in the conversations that we can have in the classroom. So as a result, I said we need to kind of rethink this, and this is where this partnership between, especially sort of museums, nonprofits, and educators can kind of come together and see what we can kind of build together. Where they had the funding, the goal of wanted to expand civic education. They can have conversations more than what we can have. We also partnered with Game Genius. They knew how to like build physical sort of games. And then my role in it was the teacher side, is how do we have teachers actually utilize these games? And partly their goal was at a lower, like younger sort of ages, which is difficult. When we talk about civic education at the younger ages, we're talking about on a more simplistic sort of level, not necessarily the socially emotional sort of like lessons that should be kind of combined with that and everything. So what we came up with is like, we're like, what is you talked about in every single sort of classroom? And we decided that it's all about developing ideas. And even in the future, when students want to advocate or they care about something, it's about that they become passionate about an idea. But how do they develop that idea? How do they improve upon that idea? How do they communicate that out? And that's what we wanted to design a sort of game up of, where they could kind of like have these skills necessary. So when they wanted to get involved in civics and whatever really their sort of interests are, that they can do that. So we designed this game. It's about developing up sort of ideas, and there would be these like challenge cards. And it would be one of the challenge cards is like, what do you deal with poverty within your community? Or what would you do with like hunger in your sort of community, or recycling? There's all these different challenges that students sort of have. And then they write down their idea. Now, when we develop ideas, a lot of times we think that it's like this eureka moment. And the reality is it goes through a lot of sort of phases. I think we learn that as adults a little bit more, that there's a lot of phases and variations of it. But kids are like, I came up with this idea. This is what my idea is, and now I'm sort of done with it. I will shelve it, or I will do like, I will try to implement it right away, rather than having this process of like trial and error and engaging with it, which games can sort of like build up and sort of encourage. Now, in order to get that sort of like feedback and everything, we created the board. We have a ranking system on this side of 1 through 10, where people will actually put markers on it and give you feedback. And it's amazing. We didn't even ask the kids to actually talk during that sort of time. We just had them rate, and immediately they started talking. Like they wanted to talk and express of like what they liked about it. On the other side, since we're dealing with younger grades, we did emojis, and the students started to are equally engaged with that, and even on a more basic level. So if we went down to like second, third grade classes and everything, we had these cards that were like yes or no cards and everything. So like we try to do this where they could get sort of feedbacks, and through several different rounds of this, they eventually like the idea has to be sort of evaluated and everything. We had what were called crown cards, and then there was really sort of like superlatives and everything, is who had the fairest idea, who had the like most innovative idea, where you might have the best idea around, but if it may not work out with you if it's not the right task or goal or and everything at the very sort of end, and doesn't sort of fit with it. Okay, so there's several stages that the students like work through and developing their sort of ideas. And I've done this with second grade classrooms all the way up to high school classrooms, with a various different age groups and like demographics and everything. And it's a really versatile sort of game, and that's what teachers sort of needed. And it was really sort of this collaboration of like when we sort of came together, that particularly we knew, especially at the younger grades, that like when we had to rethink civic engagement, that we couldn't do particularly what we usually do in like high school sort of classrooms and everything, that we need to break it down into a more fun, innovative sort of way, where on the basic level, what do people do when they want to get civically engaged? They want to communicate, they want to engage, they want to have feedback and explore things. And that's the game that we sort of kind of developed up. Now, teachers don't have a lot of time in the classroom and everything. And that's something that I was very sort of mindful about. And when I was developing this sort of up, if you can actually slide back 2 slides, Michelle, one of the things that I really wanted to do is that allow the opportunity for the game to be divided in multiple parts. So if you just want kids to engage about like challenging ideas about the community today, like you can, and you have like a few extra minutes, you could throw those challenge cards out, flip them over, and just have the kids discuss about them. If they are working on sort of projects and everything, and they need to sort of like evaluate them, you have the 1 through 10 system, you have the smiley face system, you can use the superlative cards, the crown cards, to have like judge particular ideas. They can do that. And then the other part of the game, which was the change cards, where you manipulate sort of ideas, which was some of the ways to manipulate sort of ideas would be like, I'm pulling some right now. You have to present the idea to local government, change your idea to get their support, or how would you have, how would robots use these sort of ideas? All these sort of like change cards. So if a kid is struggling developing an idea, you can give them the change cards, and they will start like manipulating that sort of idea. So they can be used in their isolated sort of parts. So at times, these are all individual skills that they need to develop in order to get more actively involved in the sort of world, right? Communication is essential. It's important to figure out how to express your sort of ideas, how to manipulate them, deal with setbacks, how to have your idea judged. All those sort of are really scary sort of things. But within game environments, it kind of takes that risk sort of out of it. It allows your kind of like vulnerabilities and put them aside, your insecurities, to save them for another sort of day and just have fun. And the kids do. Like, it's fun to see in the classroom where you're really not totally sort of engaged. Like, they're just sort of playing the game and experiencing things. If you had a current sort of issue, you can switch out a challenge card and just use the current issue and say, well, how would we deal with this sort of situation, and develop it up and see them more like play with ideas. It's just really sort of fun to see and everything. So that's kind of what we developed up with like Brave Ideas over at President Lincoln's Cottage, and kind of expanding that sort of out and everything. But I think there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of incorporate this into like classrooms and everything. So particularly with classrooms, if you look at the next sort of slide, I think a lot of times teachers get a little bit sort of nervous that they like, this takes time. Teachers don't have a lot of sort of time and everything. But in all of these examples that I have up here, that's the very first version of Brave Ideas in the upper right-hand corner. We had poker chips, which I just had available. And then I like just cardstock paper, and I found smileys online. Consensus is another game in the bottom left-hand corner, which was developed by another colleague, Peter, who has it written down. Kids play in the same sort of way. They don't have to look professional. They don't actually really care that they look professional. They like playing and having fun. And it's I think that's something with teachers is kind of like breaking that sort of down. If you notice in the bottom right hand corner, this is another game that I played when we're looking at the veil of ignorance and everything with Rawls. If it's part of like philosophy and everything, and I wanted them to experience, and I just had these simple cards that were just R for rotate or S to stay, and they're on just note cards. And I think that's something when you're starting sort of out in these games, they don't have to look pretty. Like, have fun with them and everything. So on the next slide, I have like examples that I've used in the classroom and everything. And I think this is where we need to start exploring this more, bringing games into the classroom. A lot of times we think we want this particular like civics engagement, and we want to tackle this. Well, once you do that, you tripwire controversial issues and everything else. And it becomes difficult for teachers. And when teachers get in those sort of situations, they want to disengage, because the environment every year is getting worse and worse. So finding ways that are more non-threatening. So some of the things I've done is, I don't know if you played Codenames, but Codenames is a game that deals with sort of connections and everything. I developed it for comparing, contrasting concepts and everything, right? Looking at different, how through things sort of like connect together. And again, right now, I just, I did it on note cards is where that developed up. I teach philosophy. I saw this game. It wasn't really school like appropriate on some of the cards that they have. I just redesigned it to make it appropriate. There's a lot of things that we do that we can take inspiration around us and sort of like redevelop them up so that we can utilize them in the ways that we want, and kind of reinvent them and play ourselves. Some other sort of examples when we're talking about like on the next slide of where we don't have to develop these complex sort of systems and everything is I was looking at deductive reasoning. I didn't make any changes to the game. I just had the kids play Mastermind. For deductive reasoning, it was 20 questions. There's no parts to that sort of game. There's no setup to that sort of game. So when you're talking about like in classrooms and everything on how to change that sort of perception of teachers seeing games as like, these are a lot of work or I don't have enough time to it, there are ways to do it that don't take up a lot of sort of time and can develop that sort of non-threatening environment, and that breaks down these sort of like vulnerabilities that a lot of times students have. On the next slide as well, I have some other examples. Ulysses is a game for inductive reasoning, but I also talked about lying and truth. I teach philosophy and everything, and we looked at motivations of lying and truth. And there's a game that's very popular in the US, at least. It's called Cheats. I doubt it, or you might have heard it as like BS, but I have to like rename it a little bit. And this game is a very simple sort of where the students have to like put cards down in a row, 2, 3, 4, 5, and when they put them face down, they'll say like 2 2s and everything. They might not actually have 2 2s, and if they get called out on it, they have to pick up the whole entire deck. It's a very simple sort of game and everything. But after it, I was like, well, what were the motivations when you tried to lie? What were your goals? How did you feel when you were doing that? It really opens them up. And we talked about ideas of truth and lying and the motivations behind it. And it all started with 10 minutes. We played that sort of game at the beginning of class, and I kind of tricked them into it. I was just like, well, let's have fun with this game today. And then I was like, oh, by the way, we're talking about lying and cheating, and you just played a game on lying and cheating. So let's talk about it. Okay. And I think that there's just really a lot of opportunities that we can kind of engage students that are not necessarily like take up huge amounts of time and everything, but we can target particular skills. And these are really important skills for them to sort of like develop on how to reason through things, how to look at motivations, how to develop up sort of ideas. And it's over time, the students can kind of like do things on their sort of own. But I think it's a kind of rethinking of how can we work with classrooms and teachers who are more of sort of disengaging in this new sort of environment, and providing opportunities to have these sort of conversations that are sometimes difficult and non-threatening sort of ways.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat box. I wanted to go over just a little bit about the basics of game design and also share a few kind of games I've had. So as Brian mentioned, I think one of the biggest things that I've noticed when working with educators or even with partners like the museums, they want people to have a great learning experience. And this is where the game can provide that experience. But then it can be tricky to sit down and think, well, how do I do this? And so we have two options. One is just saying and accepting, I'm going to just take a little bit of time and build something that I can use over and over and over again. And again, start simply, start small. We'll give, I have even more examples. But what is it I want to achieve and how am I going to get there? So I think, for instance, if you notice that your class is really having a hard time opening up or just even expressing what they think, this could be something where you say, you know what, maybe a game can provide an opportunity for that. Or maybe current events are happening and you want them to be able to have, instead of just a debate, just more conversations around that issue so that they can dissect it. And whether they do anything with it or not, it might just be something that's weighing heavily on them and they need an opportunity to talk and share experiences. But maybe you decide, I want to create a game around that. So I think the first basics of game design is just kind of creating a story arc. What are you doing with your game? So this is where you might use classroom content. It might be that you're trying to address a problem that you're seeing in the classroom or that students are having. Maybe it's a skill that you want to build, but use your story arc as an opportunity to address that. And in doing so, you'll kind of determine the role of your players, which I imagine are your students, and how they will immerse themselves in their game. The second part of game design is really thinking about goals. What's the purpose of the game? What do you want to achieve? What should players do? How can you win? I think it's also important to know that sometimes with games, it's okay if like there's not necessarily a winner. Sometimes kids are happy to have an experience, but usually in most games, there's kind of like a way to succeed. And I think that's what makes it fun, is that kind of healthy dose of competition. So thinking about the goals that you want to achieve. So if it is about getting kids to communicate more effectively with one another, maybe you want to try a sort of role-playing game, because essentially your goal is to get kids to talk. And maybe the way they win the game is by, someone, as Brian mentioned, like they get the most smiley face emojis or something like this, but it doesn't need to be complicated. So a story arc and goals. And then the other two biggest pieces are decisions. How do you help kids immerse in the game? Usually they need to take an action. So for instance, I'll continue with my role-playing example. They probably will need to decide what role they're going to take on, what they're going to say, how grandly they're going to say it. Some kids can be very theatrical. Some kids are more reserved and are not going to want to communicate like that. So they might need to make decisions. There might be different ways that they can act, and you need to think about how they take those actions. And then I think this is the other biggest piece with the games is the debrief. Just playing a game sometimes isn't enough. I think having that reflection piece where you actually talk about the skills that you gained, because sometimes they don't, and I think we do this a lot in education. I don't think we always take the time to say, what did you gain by doing this activity, this project, this game? And usually I've noticed when I ask kids, what did you just experience? What did you just do? They will tell me, well, we had to talk to each other. Yeah, my group didn't work that well together, and it's okay, but it's them getting a chance to talk about some of these social emotional skills that we discuss. I know I had played a game recently. It was a futures literacy, the thing from the future. And it was interesting because this group of girls had told me they don't feel like they're heard, like they want to use their voice. And I had this anonymous feedback thing, and I was going to write everyone's kind of post-its up and give it to the principal. And they didn't participate. And I told them at the end, I'm like, this was your opportunity to use your voice. Why didn't you take it? And they didn't realize it. And I think sometimes in having reflections, right? Because sometimes even kids will say, no one hears me, no one listens. But then if they get the opportunity, they don't realize when it's there. And so I think sometimes offering kids this kind of debrief and reflection to understand the skills that they're gaining or the opportunities that they have can help them to think more and realize when things are happening, like when they're doing things, when they're developing skills, and when opportunities are available to them. Because I think, problem finding, opportunity finding, this is something that's not always natural, that sometimes having these reflection pieces help us to take those ideas further. With, again, the basics of game design, a lot of it's just trial and error. And another thing too is teachers don't need to make the game. Kids are actually really good at making the game. Like you can give them the objective and let them do it themselves. For instance, kids, maybe they make a Jeopardy game or a trivia game or a game like they've seen on TV, but, let them build their media skills and create their own game. Sometimes in doing that, that's a way for them to demonstrate that they know the content and apply it. Sometimes there's basic games. I think this is just one on feelings. This is one we did. And again, cardboard boxes make great game bases. It's easy to make a spinner. You can just get a little clasp and a paper clip. This was a kindness game. And, this is a 5-year-old. Oh, and each color represented a different action. And they had to give an example of how you show kindness or how you show honesty or how you show you're a community helper. Simple games like Candyland, maybe you bring in some dice or something like that, but kids are really good at prototyping and coming up with their own sorts of games. Even if it's something that maybe you don't want to do, maybe you could take a specific issue, how in our community, I don't know, it's always overwhelming when you think about the opportunities, but what might we do in our community to create change? I'd like you to create a game to engage more adults. What would be a game you would play with your parents to engage them in an issue you care about? And maybe they come up with truth or dare cards. Maybe they come up with, some role-playing thing. Who knows? But I think sometimes even posing the question to them and helping them to gamify it is a way to also help them engage and apply content and build those skills. A few other things, there's also print and plays. This is just, going on Canva and making your own cards and resources. I wanted people to have deeper conversations, so I started like a conversation menu. So you set the chairs up like you're actually at a restaurant, and then you kind of time the conversation with, maybe the starter question is, what do you feel is an issue that matters in the world? And then, the main 3 courses could be something that's a bit deeper that guides them, and the dessert might be like, and what might you do about it? A take action kind of thing. But sometimes just kind of creating the experience helps kids to come alive. And this has actually also worked really well with just adults. Over here too, like we had the meet in the middle game, the loaded word game. These are questions that I hear thrown around a lot, specifically in the US. And I think people have really, for instance, I put politician, and for whatever reason, a lot of times if I mention politician, the kids always assume if you're a politician, you're a horrible human, like you're a narcissist and you're this and you're that. And I'm like, well, do you think maybe we want good leaders? Should we associate being a politician as something, worthy? Because if all the politicians are bad people, yet they're the ones making our decisions, aren't we putting ourselves in a bit of a catch-22 if we want a better world? So how do we shine that in a good light? But we noticed kids needed a space to actually just stop and step back and think about the words they were using, and how other people in their circles were using the words. So for instance, freedom, I loved the differences I saw with the word freedom. I have had, in the US, does freedom truly mean to just do whatever you want with no regard to anybody? And for some kids, that was kind of the definition they were coming up with, where it's, very an individualistic, like, this is my right, it doesn't matter what it does to anybody else. And so I noticed just even focusing on words, and how we use language was really critical to opening up some dialogue. This meet in the middle game too, I think in times of polarization, how do we show that I think we all have more in common than we believe? I do think in a time as well where if you have a lot of censorship, it can be really difficult as well to showcase how sensationalized the sides are sometimes, and that actually a lot of people do want the same things, and that a lot of us are in the middle. So I think there's just different ways. If there's concepts that you want to approach, there's ways to go back to those, basics of game designs and say, how do I build a game around this? Do I do it? Do my kids do it? Does the community partner do it? What's the experience I want for these children? What's that story arc? How do I immerse them in this? And what are the goals of this? Like, what are they learning from this? And how do I make that happen through the actions and through the debrief? And this is where games are powerful. I think they can do a lot more than us talking to people, than us reading something. But I think it's up to us to find opportunities to create these learning experiences and opportunities for young people, for adults. Adults like games as well. And it provides just a more constructive way, I think, to engage in a lot of things. I think people are more open when they play games. And I also think since they think it's a game, they just don't take it as seriously. So it kind of like lowers the temperature on certain issues. And with that, that is everything I think we have to say.